What is up guys, Blue Spooky here. Just wanted to let you know before we get started with this video that this is going to be a weekly recap of all the stories that have been told in the week in one distinct video. I'm going to be doing these once a week on Sundays so that if you haven't been able to catch any of the videos, or if you just like something long to go to sleep to or listen to in the background, you can put this video on without having to worry about anything. There will also only be ads at the beginning and end and not in the middle of the video, so you also don't have to worry about that either. For this particular episode, some people have been telling me that they like the background black so that it helps them sleep because they don't have to turn down the dimness on their phone, so I'm going to have the background black for this episode, but let me know if you guys don't like it and we can return to some of the rain footage and stuff that I have in the other longer compilation backgrounds. Without further ado, I will let you guys get into enjoying your long video. Thank you for watching. I've pushed this from my mind in the past couple of months, mostly because any activity has seemingly stopped. Yet somehow I knew this silence was too good to be true, and eventually we would hear from him again, sooner or later. This whole thing started a few months ago. A guy messaged me on Facebook, and unlike the usual creepy messages I get, this one sounded intelligent and funny. We started chatting from time to time, talking about anything and everything. He told me he was divorced with one child, and I empathized every time he would complain about his ex-wife, even though it also kinda bothered me that he would tell all those personal details to a virtual stranger. After all, no matter what happened between them, she was still the mother of his child. I mean, have some respect, right? We continued chatting, and I started to get more relaxed. We were at the stage where we would often discuss our daily lives, and inevitably, I'd talk about my best friend, with whom I'm extremely close. We were almost like sisters, in fact. At that particular time, she was very busy with changes happening at her work, and some issues with a guy she'd met. She said things were complicated and she would explain the details when there was more time to meet up. Now keep in mind that under normal circumstances, I would have known every little detail about that, but as it happened then, there wasn't sufficient time to properly see each other and talk, so I only knew the basics of the situation. No names, no pictures, nothing like that. So here I am talking to my guy. For the sake of privacy, we'll call him Jake. I start noticing that every time we do, he would casually direct the conversation towards my best friend, Jenna. I had mentioned to him that we knew each other since we were babies, practically grew up together even, so he would always ask me to tell him funny stories from our childhood and teen years, then proceed inquiring about what she's like now, what kind of guys she likes, stuff like that. I would jokingly ask him if he got tired of me and wanted her number, but he would deflect it with awkward humor, so I didn't really think much of it past that. Some time had passed since then, and things were a bit calmer at Jenna's work. We finally got to sit down and meet for drinks. Inevitably, we start discussing Jake. I tell her about him. She's smiling and nodding along, until I take my phone out and show her his pictures. She immediately goes pale in the face. She grabs my phone. "This is him. This is the guy I told you about." At first, I assumed she was joking, as she was prone to messing with me somewhat, but she looked dead serious. So I started asking some questions. Turns out she'd met him on a dating app. They talked first, and she was under the same impression I was, that he was smart, charming, cultured, so when he eventually asked her out, she gladly accepted. They went out, had drinks, talked, and everything was fine until the end of the evening. He got a little bit too grabby and insistent for more than just a goodnight kiss. He insisted to drive her home even though she had her own car there, and suggested that he could pick her up in the morning to get her car. Since she didn't want him to know where she lived, and she was annoyed at his advances, she refused and managed to escape him somehow. She had told me she was afraid he would follow her home, so instead she went to a bar where a friend of hers worked after that. The next day, he called her and apologized for his behavior at the end of the evening, blamed all the drinks and the stress at his work. Then he told her he had to admit something to her, because he really liked her and wanted to be honest with her. She agreed and they met again. He admitted that he was actually in the process of getting a divorce, but hadn't yet filed for it, and was still living with his wife and small child. She didn't have a job, and he couldn't just leave her alone tending for their child before she was financially stable. Jenna, being the blunt gal she is, called bullshit on his story and accused him of being yet another married man out to cheat and using false excuses for sympathy. Turned out the guy worked as a sales rep, so he was really smooth and convincing. I don't know how, but he managed to appease her doubts, at least to a point of not immediately cutting him off right there and then. Some time passes and he chats to her online, calls her and they talk, but she tells him that the only way she would even consider getting intimate with him would be if she sees proof that he's actually divorced and lives separately from his family. One day he calls her and tells her that he'll put his wife on the phone to prove to her that even though they live together, they sleep in separate rooms and are technically separated. A woman's voice really did confirm that, but it left Jenna more puzzled than reassured. She was conflicted because despite everything, she actually liked the guy and was therefore worried to not get herself into a mess if she fell deeper. She was still hesitant to accept his invitations to meet at this point. One day he accidentally walked past the place she worked at, exactly at the same time she finished working. What are the chances, right? She agrees to go grab a drink, as long as they talk and act platonic. Apparently, that's also when she tells him about her life more, her childhood. This is where I'm brought into the conversation. He listens intently, and afterwards, when she and I compared timelines, it turns out that exactly a few days after this discussion, he started to message me on Facebook. We were both livid and incredulous, so we decided to confront him separately and then compare our notes together. When I got back home, I texted him, asking why he'd lied to me that he was divorced when he was clearly still living with his family. More importantly, why he started talking to me when he was already seeing my best friend. He was unprepared for that question. He bounced back quickly, though, and gave me some bullshit explanation about how he was curious about me when he'd heard so much from Jenna and wanted to see what I looked like. He scrolled through her Facebook friends list and found me. Mind you, at this point she had not added him on Facebook, so he basically stalked her profile to gather that information, just like she never told him where she worked, yet he somehow knew to accidentally walk past there at the perfect time. When Jenna confronted him, he told her that he was just curious and wanted to hear about her from the person that knows her best friend. She told him that it was wrong and creepy on so many levels, but he insisted he had no bad intentions, and that he just liked her so much that his curiosity got the better of him. When we compared notes after that, Jenna and I decided to just stop talking to him altogether. The guy was a heavy liar, and was just extremely weird. We each told him that we didn't want to talk to him or see him again, and even though he was shocked and tried to convince us otherwise, he eventually accepted this, and said that if we changed our mind he would be happy to talk. At that point, we thought it was over. Oh, the naivete. At first, he did seem to take it well, but then he would accidentally send a picture or a message which was intended for someone else, but mistakenly send it to me or Jenna, just so he could try and initiate a conversation. He would attempt to ask me or her out again, get refused, then retreat, until more and more accidental messages and calls. After a while of this, the random bumping into each other ensued. Wherever we would go, on my way to work, at the market, at a random cafe, at Jenna's gym, he would somehow be there every time. Of course, it was all random coincidence. We started to get more annoyed than anything at this point. We still thought he was just a lying bastard, but pretty harmless, so there was not much we could do, except to wait it out thinking he would eventually move on. How wrong we were. One day, suddenly, Jenna comes to my place all freaked out. She tells me she was on a date with a new guy she'd just met when she saw Jake passing by the restaurant she was in. Later, he called her in hysterics, screaming at her. "Look at what you did. I can't get you out of my mind. Because of you, I hit my child, and I chased my wife out of the house in the cold." She got fed up with him, so she told him to never bother her again and go seek a therapist because he clearly had issues. Then she blocked him. That creeped us both out though, because even after blocking him, not only was he not moving on, He seemed to be escalating and getting aggressive. I told her that if he called again, she should threaten him with calling the police and reporting that he was allegedly abusive towards his family. We were in the middle of discussing this when I got a call from an unknown number. Normally I don't pick these up, but I was also waiting for an important package to be delivered, so I thought it could be from the courier company. It was him. He was crying, sobbing on the phone, pleading with me to convince Jenna to unblock him, that it wasn't fair. I had to help him. He sounded insane, to be honest. I was shocked to hear him in this state. It was such a contrast to his normally smooth demeanor. So I calmly told him that he should act like a grown man and calm the fuck down. It wasn't my place to do anything after she'd made up her mind, especially after his crazy behavior and threats about beating his child. He then told me he didn't really do that, but he wanted to make us feel guilty and scare Jenna into talking to him. He started apologizing profusely and said he was at his wit's end and didn't know what to do. I told him this had gone on far enough. He was a 35-year-old male and should act like it. If he ever proceeded to contacting or stalking us even more, I would go directly to the police. I hung up and blocked him as well. The police threat seemed to work finally. We haven't heard from him for about 2 months, but yesterday, Jenna and I were at a birthday party at a club, and guess who was the birthday girl's +1? Last year, I went out of state for my first year of college to a school in Indiana. In the first week, I formed many friendships. One of those was with a boy who would end up becoming my stalker. He was fairly normal at the start, and I genuinely enjoyed his company, as well as his roommates. We eventually became quite close, spending a lot of time together. Soon I had developed friendships with other people, and he became a part of my larger friend group. About a month or so into knowing him, I started to get a feeling that he might like me more than a friend. I still acted normal around him, because I didn't want to draw attention to it. The feelings weren't exactly mutual, and I didn't want to ruin our solid friendship. One night, about 3 months into school, everything changed. This night, all of my friends came to my dorm room. At the time, it was a double I was occupying by myself, to drink before they went to a party. I had told my friends that they could drink in my room, but I didn't want to go out because I was very upset by a hurricane that was hitting my town in Florida. All of my friends were very supportive of this, except my soon-to-be stalker. Throughout the time he was in my room, he was making jokes about how dramatic I was being, even when everyone else told him to stop. He just wouldn't let up. Finally, everyone was ready to leave and go to the party. My stalker was the last to exit my room. Before going, he told me that he cared about me, and that if I changed my mind and decided to go out, or if I needed anything, that I should text him. I found this quite strange given his previous behavior, but I figured he had come to his senses and was now attempting to be a good friend. A couple hours after my friends leave, I get a text from another friend, telling me to come help our one friend who was too drunk and is vomiting. I change and walk to her building. Upon arriving, I find out she's fine now, and that they'd already put her to bed. I went outside the building to cry about what was happening in my hometown, on the steps by myself. I got a text from my stalker asking if I had changed my mind. In the moment, I was sad, and figured that maybe if I went out with them and drank, I would feel a little bit better. I told him where I was and asked if the group wanted to meet up. He said they would come, but he arrived alone. He suggested to me that we hang out in my room, but I told him I wanted to go see the group. He didn't seem to be too happy with this. I called one of my other friends to see where they were, and we go to another dorm building where they're drinking. The party was busted, so they'd already left. When we get inside, we had a hard time figuring out which floor they were on and what room they were in. My stalker was visibly drunk at this point, and pushed me into one of the connecting suites that was vacant. He began to make fun of me again for being upset, and became very touchy. I pushed him off of me, and yelled at him to stop. Finally, we found one of our friends. That friend told us we could meet him in his room, and he had alcohol there. My stalker suggested we just go to his room instead, because he was in a fight with one of the other guys and didn't want to see him. I believed this and agreed. When we got to his room, we were greeted by his roommate and a bunch of his roommate's friends. My stalker grabbed a backpack with his alcohol and said we should just go to my room. Our friend group can meet up with us, so we do. My dorm had 2 beds in it. My stalker sits down on the one I sleep on, so I decide to sit on the other one. He put on a movie and everything was normal at first. I immediately began texting my one friend, whose room everyone was in, and told him to bring everyone over to my room. My friends were all drunk at this point, and everyone I texted was not making sense. My stalker hopped into the same bed as me and lied beside me. I immediately felt uncomfortable and started rapidly texting my friends to tell them that he was acting strange and they needed to come now. He saw I was on my phone a lot, so he grabbed it from my hands and told me that I needed to take a 10-minute break from it. During this time, he became very touchy. I told him it had been 10 minutes and that he needed to give me my phone back, but he denied even knowing what I was talking about. I stood up and moved to the other bed because I began to feel uncomfortable. He got up and moved as well. I sat at the very end of the bed, opposite of him, and demanded my phone. He continued to play dumb. Instead, he moved closer to me and tried to touch me even more. I had had enough at this point and told him he needed to give me my phone right now and that this wasn't funny anymore. He told me he needed to go to the bathroom. While he was in there with my phone, I grabbed my laptop and I messaged all of my friends to come to my room ASAP and told them he was being very creepy and I needed their help right now. Once he returned from the restroom, he told me he wanted to level with me and that he thinks we should hook up. I had been making it very clear the entire time that I did not want that and thought he would be able to read my body language and the situation and realize I was clearly uncomfortable. I told him no, and that I wanted to just be his friend and not ruin the relationship. He didn't listen. He came over to me and started playfully grabbing me. I pushed him off and told him to stop. He pushed me down onto the bed and tried to come over me. He grabbed my legs and pulled me into him. I was thankfully sober and was able to kick him away from me and get up and run into the hallway. He didn't chase after me though. He just began to insult me and tell me he never wanted to be my friend in the first place and only wanted to sleep with me, that guys and girls can never be friends. It always has to lead to something more. He starts yelling about how he would never date me, that I'm too emotionally unstable, a slew of other insults. One thing that he especially said that scared me was that he was raised to take what he wanted no matter what when defending his actions. I didn't know what to do. I just started crying and yelling at him to leave my room. He refused and made fun of me for crying. At this point, he still had my phone and wouldn't give it back or leave. I threatened to call the campus police. That finally did it. He agreed to leave. After that night, he texted me every day for a week, trying to talk to me. One of my friends told me to at least listen to what he had to say, so I did. He ended up confessing his love for me and told me he still thinks we can't just be friends, even after I said multiple times that's all we could ever be. Ultimately, I told him I thought we needed to stop talking altogether. All my other friends knew what happened, and dropped him from the friend group as well. After this, he spent months trying to talk to me. He became just completely obsessed. I would still hang out with his roommates, but I would only go to their room when he wasn't there. On the few occasions where he would come in, he would later text me paragraphs about how immature I was being for ignoring him. Eventually, I said we could try to be civil and just be acquaintances to be nice, but that led to him getting very mad at me for still acting uncomfortable around him and not wanting to hang out alone with him. At this point, every time I would see him, he would blow up my phone and text me non-stop about me being fake towards him and that I needed to get over myself. Finally, I blocked him. After doing this, he got extremely angry. He would show up where I was all the time and just stare daggers at me. His roommates would tell me he talked about me every night for the rest of the school year. He would try to ask them little things about I was doing and play detective on who I was hooking up with. He even tried to fight a guy who expressed he was interested in taking me out on a date. A few months after the incident, he started making up excuses to come to my door almost every other day. He started trying to talk to me in the hallways as well. He would offer me his things and even buy me random presents. The last few months of school, he told his roommate his goal was to sleep with me before graduation, and that he thought I wanted him and was just playing games with him. I in no way did, or even made it seem this way. At this point, I only acted completely disgusted toward him. Even over the summer, he was constantly texting his roommates about me. All of my friends told me he started stalking me, and recognized that the way I was acting was in no way asking for his attention. I go back to school in the middle of August, and he will be there. He'll be living in a frat next year, so I don't have to worry about him being on my floor still, but he still worries me. I think something is very wrong with him emotionally or mentally, and not just because of the way he's acted towards me, just the way he acts in general. I don't want anything to happen to myself or anyone else, and I think I should do something about it. Looking back on that night, I would say his behavior and the things he said were very rapey, and that people who think if I want something I should take it no matter what are at a higher risk to sexually assault someone. I'm a 24-year-old female that moved from Orlando, Florida, to 18 miles outside of Valdosta, Georgia, in the middle of nowhere, to my family farm. Never had any issues in Orlando, but I got divorced and had to move in with my mom. It was my 2 small boys and I. Anyways, we moved into one of the old farmhouses on my family's farm. It needed a lot of work. It was 8 bedrooms and a mother-in-law suite, I think. When we moved in, we only had 2 rooms cleaned up, and worked on the rest of the house over the course of 9 long months. The man across the street, who we will call Jay for the purposes of this story, was actually very helpful. From day one, he would come over almost every day as he was feeding his animals, and help with anything I needed. Over the course of 9 months, I never had any issues with him, and thought he was just a very friendly middle-aged man. I never once in that entire time felt he had any ill intentions. The farmhouse was in a U-shape. The room I chose had windows in the courtyard area. This was the middle of the house. Jay had fenced in that area when I first moved in, so I could let the boys out to play. The farmhouse was in the middle of the farm and set off the road, so I never had any worries of being watched, mostly as my bedroom windows are in a fenced area in the middle of the house. I decided I didn't really need to put any curtains on my bedroom or bathroom. One day, my son was playing under the carport when Jay pulled up in his truck. He was going to look at my car for me. Jay didn't even make it to the carport, though, before my eldest son said to me, "Hey, I saw him in my window last night." Later that night, I talked to him. He told me that he did see Jay out a window. I asked him if it was the kitchen window, because you could see his horse pasture, and he stopped to feed them every morning and night. And chalking it up to that, I didn't really think too much about it. But other things began to happen. I guess you could say I really wanted him to be the person I thought he was, so I overlooked a lot of suspicious behavior. Stuff like my favorite candy somehow appearing in my fridge one day after school. My mom told me she'd remembered me telling Jay it was my favorite. Someone also began sending me flowers every Friday for a couple of months. I thought it was my ex-husband, or possibly my boyfriend at the time, but neither would ever admit to it. My boyfriend jokingly told me it was Jay. The next day I came home from school with my mom, and had the boys playing under the carport. Jay was working on my car. My air suspension had a leak, and Jay had offered to look at it before I took it all the way to Tallahassee for extensive repair. When I got out of my mom's car, he asked me if I wanted to see the leak he had found. As I bent over the hood, Jay stepped back. When I turned around, I commented jokingly on his 90s-era cell phone. He had it right in his hand. It's the type you don't see anymore, like a very early camera flip phone. Later that night, we came inside, and my mom told me she could have sworn Jay had taken a picture of me on his phone. It sounded crazy. I know it sounds crazy now, but at the time I really didn't believe her. This man was seriously always friendly, never any weird vibes from him. If I offered to pay him, it was always at cost, and that was rare, as he would not accept my money. I should have known that people just aren't like that these days. I guess I was just really naive. A couple weeks later, I was mowing my courtyard. It was grown up pretty bad. As I got close to my window, my heart literally sank into my butt. I had a newly placed center block outside both windows, and my bathroom window. I can't tell you how. but I knew at that point that I had made a huge mistake, and everyone was right about Jay. I called my friend and neighbor Josh to come look at the center blocks. He ran home and got a deer cam, attaching it to a tree outside my window. This was at 3 p.m. in the afternoon. That night I came home around 6 and was unloading the boys when I turned around. Jay was standing right behind me. "Hey, I didn't mean to scare you. I heard your mama was out of town." I said yes, sir. I knew he knew because they were friends on Facebook. He told me to call him if I got scared or needed anything. I got the boys inside and settled, and we got snuggled into bed. They fell asleep in my bed. When I realized I had missed Sunday's episode of Game of Thrones, I went to my mom's bed to watch. I was lying there talking to my ex-husband about the boys and the show, when Josh called. He asked if my boyfriend was over. I told him no. This was at 9:02 p.m. He then told me a man was standing outside my window. The deer cam snapped the first picture at 9:02 p.m. My boys were in my room sleeping. Josh told me not to worry. He was already coming up the driveway, and to meet him outside. Fear and dread literally drained through me. I slowly walked into my room and calmly scooped up my boys. I shut that door and sprinted through the house as fast as I could. We sat in Josh's truck until the police arrived. The deer cam snapped photos at 9:02, 9:22, and 9:30. He stood outside my window that long, waiting for me to come back. The police walked through the field and could see where he had parked, but by this point he was already gone. I showed them the photos and ID'd Jay. He was arrested at 2 a.m. that morning. When they went through his phone, they found 9 months of pictures. Pictures of me mowing, pictures of me playing with my kids, pictures of me in my bathroom, sleeping, bending over the hood of my car. He had been watching me the entire time. I couldn't and didn't sleep for weeks. He ended up getting out of jail the following weekend and came into my mom's post office. She's a mail lady. He told her he had found my dog dead and buried it for me. Even after that, he only received 5 years probation and a restraining order. He still lives across the street. I stayed only for maybe 3 months after. Then I moved on to Fort Walton Beach. This story just came out of nowhere. I truly wasn't expecting any of this. I've had creepy people and weird things happen, but generally speaking, I'm aware of my surroundings most of the time, and don't really have many issues with this sort of thing. At the time this happened, I had just broken up with a boyfriend, moved back home for the summer until school was starting back up that fall. I got some full-time work at the gas station a mile from my parents' house, and goofed off with some of my hometown friends. That was my whole summer plan. Things were going quite well for the first month. I never really realized, though, just how many creeps come into the gas station, even when we were in a fairly nice suburb area. We, of course, had our regulars. One of them, a late 30s guy, started to intentionally wait in my longer line to be checked out by me, and various other small things like that. Looking back, I was a bit oblivious. A 21-year-old girl that, due to a previous abusive relationship, did not see myself as fairly attractive. I just thought all these guys were being friendly and nice. At first, he starts only coming to my register. Then suddenly I would see him a few times a shift. I noticed he would always seem very polite, very well-mannered, never really giving off any skeevy vibes at all. He also had a couple of tween daughters that would be with him here and there, which made him seem even more harmless to me. Generally speaking, I worked early morning shifts, but flipped to later shifts as I have always been a night owl, getting maybe a couple hours of sleep before I had to go in for the early ones. When that happened, this creep was very upset with me that he wasn't able to come in and see me because he worked second shift. At this point, I started actively avoiding him, stalking the cooler if I saw him pull up, etc. He started to come in, though, when I would get off work. I would try to delay myself until he left. After this, I started getting notes and flowers on my car, until one night I'm walking out to my vehicle when he just suddenly popped up from behind it. I backed up and told him I was not interested at all. He assured me he would woo me and change my mind eventually. I switched schedules immediately after that, to working nights, days, mornings, just all over the place, so that my schedule was never predictable. Well, here I am working one afternoon, when up comes this batshit crazy woman with 2 younger girls with her. She starts asking her daughters if this is the girl, to which they replied yes. This maniac of a woman starts screaming and threatening me to stay away from her husband. I was so confused. Lady, I have no idea what you're talking about. Apparently, this psycho stalker man was married and had been telling his wife he had a hot young gas station attendant girlfriend that was moving in with him. The lady was nuts though. Her daughters looked super embarrassed and she would just not leave the gas station. The store owner watching on video from the back called the cops, and the lady was eventually told to leave. At the time, I was dating, going out on a few dates. This one handsome fella started coming out to make sure when I left at night that the guy wasn't just going to pop out again. Now, normally at nights we had 2 people, but this night the other girl had called in. I have no idea how the creepy stalker man noticed, but he slipped in 10 minutes to close and just kept me company while I was doing nightly closing activities. He would make these cryptic comments about how no girl should be here alone at night like this. Why wouldn't I just give him a chance? He'd move me in, buy me a car, all kinds of creeperisms. I told him no thank you, and reminded him that his wife was not too keen on this either. The man immediately flew into a rage. He knocked over a whole display and started screaming at me. "What did you tell her?" All crazy man style. At this point, I was trapped inside of the gas station after close. I didn't dare to go out into the parking lot. Where I parked my car is off the side at the back of the store. It's dark, and obviously my stalker would follow me. Thank goodness my handsome fella happened to be coming home from work and noticed my car still at the gas station. He stopped by to check up on me. As soon as he came through that door, he could see my panic, and off took the creeper, storming away into the night. My handsome fella helped me pick up the display mess, sat with me until I stopped shaking, and encouraged me to quit that job pronto. We called the police. It's a small town, and he was easily found in his white Kia driving erratically. The officer followed up with me. He had a knife, rope, and duct tape on him. I live in the downtown area of a pretty major city. My street itself is relatively quiet, but I can't say so much for the surrounding neighborhoods. My city as a whole is infamous for drug activity and gun violence. We also have an ever-increasing number of homeless people, as our shelters have all almost closed down. I've generally never minded too much. Shit happens after all, and I didn't grow up in the best of circumstances either. I would never stereotype anyone based on their housing status. I was even involved with a homeless outreach program at the time. I left and never went back after this, and I've been hesitant to help anyone else ever since. It's 10 or so at night, and I'm headed to my partner's parents' house about 30 minutes away from my own. I get about 2 blocks away before remembering I needed gas. I'm not too fond of the idea of stopping at a gas station near my apartment at this time of night, but it was also clear to me that I was just not going to make it all the way out to the suburbs. I'd pull into one in a not-so-great part of the neighborhood. At least it was brightly lit, though, and there were a lot of people walking by. I didn't get too worried about it. I got my gas real fast and walked into the store to grab a couple snacks. When I came out, though, I noticed a tall man in a black coat and brown beanie started to casually come and chat with me. I couldn't quite tell if he was 25 or 40. His voice was also so low that I could barely even make out what he was saying. Something about being a music producer and working on a new project or something. He seemed friendly enough, though. maybe a little bit erratic, so I let him ramble on for a few minutes before politely telling him I needed to get going. He told me his name was Mac. I unlocked my doors to get in, and this fucker got into the passenger seat with me. At this point, he was no longer just a friendly, chatty stranger. I was terrified. His demeanor hadn't changed at all, though. He was just sitting there acting like this was the most normal thing in the world. While I've had more than my fair share of encounters with creeps, nothing like this has ever happened to me before or since. I didn't scream. I didn't tell him to fuck off. I just sat there in fear of what he'd do to me if I resisted. "I need money for my son," he says. "He's in the hospital with a gunshot wound. His mom's waiting for me." I knew his story was bullshit right away, but I just wanted him to get out of my car. I gave him what little I had in my wallet and told him I really needed to get going. He had the nerve to turn to me and ask, "Hey, can you drive me to my friend's house? It's just up the road." What? Wasn't he supposed to be going to the hospital for his son? I tried to decline as politely as I possibly could. I told him my boyfriend was waiting for me. This opened a floodgate to a bunch of personal questions about my sex life, what my boyfriend and I are going to do when I get there, and extremely gross, unsolicited comments about my body. I tried to block out his exact words to me, but it was incredibly gross. I was sure that this was it, though. This was the end. I was trapped in my own car. The gas station parking lot was empty. I couldn't call the police, and even if I did, it would be a bad idea. I'll elaborate more on this later. I wish I could tell you I had some genius idea that helped me to get myself out of this, but I just didn't. I was panicked, frozen, and finally agreed to take him where he supposedly wanted to go. He had me drive around this random neighborhood, winding throughout dark side streets with a lot of seemingly abandoned houses for what seemed like forever. Finally, he had me stop in the parking lot of a beauty salon where his friend supposedly worked and was going to ride with her to the hospital. The parking lot was on a busy street and brightly lit. If he was going to kill me, he picked a very terrible place to try and do it. At this point, he became all over the place and started talking rapidly. Little details of his story kept changing constantly. He was clearly as high as a kite, and probably mentally unstable as well. This entire time he continued to act like we were longtime friends, and nothing about this situation was terrifying. He kept telling me he would give anything to trade places with my boyfriend. Gross. I kept gently reminding him I needed to be leaving. He kept telling me to stay because his friend would give me money to pay back for helping his son out. I couldn't help but wonder why she wouldn't have just given him the money directly if that was the case. I asked him what was taking his friend so long. He said he didn't know. Could he use my phone to call her? I wanted to say no. Maybe this was all an elaborate ploy to steal my phone and take off. I'm still thinking he could be a murderer or something, so I reluctantly handed the phone over. I should have just dialed the number for him. He took a long time while I was looking away. Then when I looked back, Jesus fuck. All of a sudden he was looking up porn and jacking off right in front of me. I wish I had a way to prove this, because I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's true and the image is burned into my mind. I guess I should have seen that one coming. At this point I just lost my cool and told him to get the fuck out. I was done with his shit. He started crying, wailing, all about how I'm just so hot, and he hated thinking about me with another man. I just turned him on so much. I was just staring at him baffled. He straightened up with a big smile on his face and said, "I'm just fucking with you. I'm not a pussy. I wouldn't cry like that. Are you sure you don't want to take me to this location instead?" Yeah, I'm fucking sure. I told him my boyfriend was already worried about me, as an hour had gone by at this point. Somehow that got his attention, and he got out and left. I drove to my partner's house shaking. He and I had just started dating at this point, and I didn't want him to think I was stupid or something, so I just nonchalantly told him I was dealing with a creep at the gas station, and it took me a while. Much later, when I told him the real story, he was appropriately horrified. I wish I could say that's where it stopped. but I started getting calls from all kinds of local numbers for the next couple of weeks. Only one voicemail was ever left. It was a lot of heavy breathing and very faint words I couldn't quite make out. I was creeped out, but I tried to dismiss it as paranoia. One time, I decided to actually answer and see who it was. "Hey, it's me, Mac. I have your money." I felt like I needed to throw up. "I don't need it. Leave me alone." I hung up as he started rambling about how beautiful I am and how he wanted to see me again. I blocked every strange number that's been calling me, and the calls finally stopped. I can't imagine how he got my number. My only thought is that when he opened up my phone to call his friend, he looked through my contacts where my own number is displayed at the top. You may wonder why I never called the police. My city is extremely well known for its police using excessive force, especially in the downtown area. People are regularly killed by the police here, and I personally witnessed people being beaten by cops for quite minor infractions. I don't intend to make any kind of political statement about the police at large or express any opinions of that sort here. I just mean to say I genuinely felt I might have been putting myself in further danger by calling these police, even after this was all over. Best case scenario, nothing would have been done, and I would have been chewed out by the cops for being stupid enough to let this man into my car. Worst case, they just come, shoot him, and I have to live with that forever. I've regretted it since, though, because a friend of mine later had an encounter with him as well on the complete opposite side of the city, and he gave her the same story about his son in the hospital. She ended up driving him around hostage aimlessly for an hour, before finally forcing him to get out. So, Mac, you're welcome, but let's never fucking meet again. Something bizarre happened to me last night, and I'd like to tell you about it if you'd like to listen. Background on me. I'm a 19-year-old male, living in a semi-large city in Ontario. It was around 11 at night, and I had just finished working out at the gym. I went to the grocery store to pick up some food for the next couple days. While there, I decided to get $120 cash back, some money that I owed my mom, and unbeknownst to me as I left the grocery store, money that I came very close to losing. Instead of going straight home, I decided to go for a little bit of a drive. I just got my car not too long ago, and the novelty of driving stick hadn't quite worn off yet. After about a half hour of driving around the city, I decided it was about time to start heading home. As I passed a gas station on the edge of town, but nearby to my house, I decided that now was as good a time as any to pull in and fuel up. When I first pulled in, I was the only one at the gas station. I was in an industrial/business part of town, at the edge, like I said, so there wasn't really much around. It was an empty lot that was without light beside the gas station. I noticed an SUV sitting there, about 100 to 200 meters away. I didn't think too much about it. I got out and started pumping the gas when I noticed a woman stumble around the corner and start walking straight toward me. As soon as I took notice of her, a small shiver ran down my spine. I instinctively locked my car. She walked toward me quickly, hands in her pockets and staring at me intensely the entire time. "Hey, I got in a fight with my boyfriend and he left me here. Can you give me a ride to my mom's house?" she said casually in her raspy smoker's voice. Another chill ran down my spine as she repeated the question, word for word almost, in the same raspy voice. I had to pump my gas first, sorry," I said to her, keeping my eyes on her the entire time. She walked around to the passenger side door, beside me. The fuel port was on the passenger side, and grabbed onto the door handle. "Can you unlock your car? I'm cold. I've been here a while." "I have to pay for the gas," I said, declining to cut the gas pumping short. I walked inside and talked to the guy behind the counter. I immediately told him that the girl outside was extremely suspicious and I did not know her. He just kinda shrugged. I could tell he wasn't too interested in getting involved, so I walked out. I figured maybe she was just high or something. I would find a way to just get her to leave me alone. As I walked out, though, I saw that the SUV I had mentioned earlier had started up. I watched the driver maneuver himself so he could just drive out the exit. He stopped with the engine still running, only 100 meters away. "So can you open the door now? I'm really cold." So many alarm bells were going off in my head already. First, she just looked sorta sketchy. She was dressed well enough, but her face was really rough. She was pretty, covered in makeup, but it didn't hide a nasty-looking sore on her lip. Her eyes were just sunken and dull, bloodshot and dead-looking. Second, she didn't exactly seem like a damsel in distress at all. She didn't seem upset about her situation. In fact, she seemed almost emotionless. "No, that's not my problem. I need to go home," I said to her as firmly as I could. "Come on, you're driving me, right?" "I can't. I have to get home right now." I reached for my phone, which I realized I had left in the car. "I'm cold. I've been out here for hours," she shouted, getting pretty angry for someone who was asking a stranger a favor, I thought. I noticed her glance at the SUV. I started cluing in to what was going on and raised my voice a bit. "Hey, that's not my problem." I walked over to the driver's side door. She started yelling at me. "I said it's not my problem." I started to raise my voice. She started raising hers. We weren't exactly yelling, but it was getting a little heated. We went back and forth like that for a couple of minutes. My mind was racing. I thought about losing my car, getting stabbed or shot, getting robbed for the $120 I had in my wallet. I just lost it on her. "You get the fuck back. You don't know who I am. You get back right now." I guess I was in fight mode at this point. I was pretty ready to just fucking clock this bitch if she tried anything, as awful as that may sound. I think I might have caught her off guard or something, because she stumbled back right away. "Well, you better get out of here right now then," she said, walking backward. I instantly felt my balls tingle and climb up inside me after she said that. I was out of fight mode and into flight mode. I watched her until she got a decent distance away, noticing she was walking straight towards the SUV. I didn't watch for much longer. I hopped in my car and peeled out of there. I turned into a random subdivision, making sure I wasn't being followed. I called the cops and they said they'd send a car there, but there wasn't much they could do because there was no real crime committed. They said I did the right thing though, and she was most likely bait for some kind of robbery. I drove home as quickly as I could. Sorry if this is all a bit wordy, but I'm not sure the best way to tell this story yet. I'm a bit obsessed with the details of what happened. That's what's got me so disturbed. The emotionless way she spoke, the creepy way she looked, that SUV. Fuck, I'm surprised I didn't just burst into tears right there. I mean, I've been jumped before, but this just seems so crazy and predatory. The last thing she said to me still haunts me. "You better get out of here right now then." Just laying it all out like that. Suddenly giving up the damsel in distress act. That has to be the worst part of this for me. Some quick backstory. I work at a gas station on a main route, so we see a lot of travelers passing through. Only one person works each shift, and it's a 24-hour store. We're a bit short-staffed, so I agreed to an overnight this time. I'm female. I work in a state that always had self-serve gas stations. So, this night, this guy comes in. I asked him if he needed any help, and he said no. He started getting gas at the pump, but told me he needed to use the bathroom. I go back to work on whatever invoices we got yesterday. The guy uses the bathroom and then goes back outside. Well, about 5 to 7 minutes later, he comes back in and tells me he's a bit confused about the pump. He directly says to me, "You might have to come outside to help me." Customers don't often say this. They usually just complain that it's not working, so I already started getting a weird feeling about this guy. I shook it off though because he looked like a nerd and I didn't really feel afraid of him. I looked at the register to see what error it came up for with his pump, only to see that there was no error displayed. The register didn't even say it was in use. Even if someone tries to pay and nothing's wrong with their payment, It will at least say payment or loyalty timed out, but it literally had no sign of him even trying to use it before coming to ask me for help. I asked him if he just wanted to pay inside. He agreed and got his wallet out of his car, then paid $10. I gave him his receipt when he said to me, "Can you please help me? I don't understand the machine." I told him we weren't really allowed to leave the store during overnight shifts, as it was just me here and it wasn't safe to go outside. I don't know why I told him I was alone, but he just didn't seem threatening. He proceeded to tell me, "I don't understand what it's asking me. I need help. I'm not scary." I told him again I couldn't go outside because it was store policy for the overnight shift. "I know you're not scary, I just can't go outside." I'd have to tell a little old lady asking for help at this hour the same thing. That much is true. We can't even take out the trash during overnights. He started to walk away from the register counter now, but stopped at the door and asked me one last time to come outside with him. I was pretty annoyed at this point. I'd said no twice now. I was clearly not going, so stop asking me. I finally said to him in a super annoyed tone, "Okay, all you need to do is 1. Pick up the nozzle, 2. Select the fuel grade button, and 3. Put it into your tank and squeeze the handle. I'm not going outside." He finally went back to his car. The register told me he had no trouble pumping the gas. Also, his plates seem like they're from the state I work in. This kind of thing wouldn't make me suspicious usually, but the fact that he originally opted for me to go outside instead of bringing the money inside is weird, along with how he didn't bother to use the pump before he came inside to ask for help, claiming it wasn't working, and him not taking no for an answer. It was just a really creepy situation. I never got along well with my father. There were issues from the very beginning growing up. For one, I liked to play with girl toys with my sister and my cousin. He always gave me a hard time for doing that. Fortunately, my mom was a much better parent and let me play with any of the toys that I wanted. Because of that rift with my dad, though, which lasted until he passed away, I never really had that father-son experience of having my first beer with him. Hell, when I got under and started going to clubs, I always had mixed drinks. I was in my mid-20s, and I still had never had my first beer. Of course, that wasn't something that I ever really thought about. I just didn't really care. Then one spring, though, I accompanied my mom to visit my grandma's house. We had a lot of relatives that always congregated there. Most of my relatives were really rural. Hell, my grandma has an outside to this day. My uncle lived in an old shack out in the hills, even more rural than my grandma did. He was quite the drinker and also a user of drugs. He would always get a bit weird when he was drinking as well. He always listened to bluegrass music and drove his pickup through the hills when he was drunk. Well, I don't know what got into me that day. Maybe I was just really bored, or maybe I was getting nostalgic for when I was younger and used to go out into the country. I used to just love riding in the back of a pickup truck when I was a kid, but I ended up telling my uncle that I'd never had my first beer yet. He also never really had a son that he could share a first beer with either. I mean, he did have a son, but he almost never spent time with him growing up. Now, first off, I should make this very clear. I in no way advocate drinking and driving. I think it's an incredibly stupid thing to do. It just didn't strike me as odd at the time because I grew up around tons of people who used to do this. Really, almost every male adult I knew grew up around it too, so it just seemed kind of normal to do. I can't tell you how tickled pink he was when I told him I'd never had a beer before. Actually, he might kick my ass if he knew the comment about tickled pink, so please forget that part. Anyway, he decided to take me for a ride and let me have my first beer. He had this really small pickup truck because he didn't really make much money. I guess that's why he was still drinking Old Milwaukee. Yeah, that was my first beer. I remember driving through the hills, sticking my elbow out the window like I had seen my uncles and such do so many times. There was just so much out there to see. We had driven pretty far out and were having a really good time. It started out nice and bright, and it was so nice driving through that area. Up and down the hills, through all the trees, the breeze from having the windows rolled down instead of using AC. And that was also when my uncle asked me if I had ever smoked a joint before. Of course I hadn't, and I let him know. He told me that if I wanted to, he had a place that we could go. We drove around for a while, and eventually the road sort of gave way to what couldn't be described as a real road at all. I mean, it was obvious people had driven there before, but rather than a road, it was just tire tracks on the ground. In the middle of the tire tracks was a grown-over leaf-covered center, and there was really only barely enough room on the sides. I kept expecting us to hit a tree or something. Eventually I noticed a house up in the distance. Well, it was one of those old silver-looking mobile homes, probably from around the 50s. He couldn't quite drive all the way up to the trailer, though. He parked a bit out and told me that he would be right back. We were probably a good 100 feet away or so from the trailer. I watched as my uncle lightly jogged up to it. Then he quickly knocked on the door, and I noticed the door open and him walk in. At first, I thought he had opened the door by himself and let himself in. It was something that people around those parts did all the time. I waited there for quite a while. I don't really have a way of telling you how long I did wait. Having a couple beers by that point, I was feeling a bit off, as you might expect. One thing I can tell you, though, is that it was getting close to dusk. There wasn't a clock or anything inside the truck, though. I kept waiting and waiting, wondering what was taking so long. I thought that perhaps my uncle had decided to have a beer with the guy he was visiting. I had experienced that very often with members of my family, deciding to have a beer and then going through about 6 of them before coming back and doing what they're supposed to be doing. After a while, the door of the trailer finally opened, but it wasn't my uncle that came out of the place. It was this very scraggly-looking guy that I had no idea who he was. He was really creepy looking, but having family from a rural area, it wasn't surprising to see people like him. What did surprise me, though, and actually made me very nervous, was that the guy came out walking immediately towards my uncle's pickup truck. I'm not really good with people that I don't know. I'm absolutely not good with these hermit types who live out in the hills alone. Hell, even my own country relatives sometimes make me nervous. Anyway, the guy came up to the truck and leaned on the door. He asked me who I was, and I told him honestly. I asked him where my uncle was. He was very evasive on the comment. He then began asking me if I wanted to come in to have a beer with him and my uncle. Now, I really didn't. If you had seen this trailer as well, you wouldn't have wanted to go anywhere near it either. It looked like something you would expect to see from a 1970s horror flick. I thanked him for the offer, but told him I was not interested. I would just wait for my uncle in the truck. He told me that if that was the case, I might have a very long time to wait. I didn't know how to take that. It was a very uncomfortable thing to say, and it gave me a bit of a shudder. I responded that I didn't mind waiting a bit. I was just uncomfortable going into the homes of people I didn't know. The guy did something that really annoyed me. He introduced himself by name and stuck his hand out, as if that was supposed to try and make me somehow know him personally immediately. He kept being insistent and pushy, and the more he did, the more I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. Suddenly, I noticed the door of the trailer open. I looked past the man, expecting to see a friend of the creepy guy come out and try to help him. What I noticed was my uncle stumbling out of the house, holding a part of his chest. The guy noticed me look behind him, and he turned around. He also noticed my uncle. As my uncle stumbled closer, he turned and ran over to him. The two began to fight, and I was confused as to what to do. Even though my uncle was injured somehow, he was still a lot bigger than the guy, and after a struggle was able to get the better of him. My uncle laid him flat and then got over to the car. "Get over," my uncle told me. "I need you to drive and get us out of here." I slipped over to the driver's side, and my uncle got into the other side. The weird guy had already gotten back up and was running after the truck. He was able to get to it as I turned around to leave, and actually climbed up into the truck bed. I was moving, so I hit the brake and then the gas again quickly, which caused him to lose his grip and fly off the back of the truck. I began driving to get out of there as quickly as I could. I had a very hard time finding my way out of that area and back to my grandparents' house. I was still a little tipsy from the beer and thought if I could just get there safely, a completely sober driver could drive my uncle to the hospital. What had happened was that he had gone in to buy some weed from the guy. They had gotten into an argument over money, and the guy claimed my uncle already owed him. After my uncle gave him the money, he didn't give my uncle any of the weed, claiming it was a back payment. My uncle got pissed and tried to get his money back. The two struggled and my uncle got stabbed. My uncle ended up being fine in the end. Other than his injury, there was something about this that stuck with me for quite a while. Since the guy had already stabbed my uncle, what was he intending on doing to me if I went into the house? He had invited me in, and obviously I would have seen my uncle stabbed. He obviously had very ill intentions for the both of us, and I haven't had a beer since. It has nothing to do with the experience, though. I just think it tastes nasty. I used to always like thunderstorms. I liked every aspect of them. I liked the thunder, the lightning, the dark, the wind, the rain. There's always been something about a thunderstorm that's just so appealing. I was never that kid who was scared to death of the thunder when he was a child. Instead, I looked forward to it. When I was a teenager, I moved my bed so that it was facing the opposite of a window, looking across the street at other homes, mainly one particular house. Whenever a storm was coming, I would plop myself down on the bed and just watch the storm. If the wind was not blowing toward my house, I would actually open the window just a bit so the sounds of the wind and rain would not be drowned out. On the day this story happened, there was quite a nasty storm brewing outside. There were dark black and green clouds moving in that soon took up the entire sky. The wind was just pounding away at my house. While I was watching the storm, more than once I watched a shingle from our roof fly off the house and get totally blown away. Looking it up on the weather report, we were apparently getting gusts of wind that topped 70 miles per hour. I was 16 years old at the time, and I was also home by myself. My parents had gone to visit some cousins of theirs for the weekend, and I really didn't feel like going. I had a lot of homework to do, and was trying to get into a good college. So fortunately, they let me remain home by myself. I got my laptop, propped up some pillows on my bed, and laid back against them, and decided to just watch the storm. I had some snacks and a drink, and just watched the free show that was happening outside my window. The wind and thunder were extremely loud. I had never quite experienced something like this before. It was just so wild. I don't really remember how long I had been sitting there, alternating between looking at my laptop, doing my work, and looking up outside the window. What I do recall, however, is looking up and out the window when I heard this extremely loud noise and felt my house shake worse than it had all day. By that point, the storm had been going on for quite a while, too. I looked up and saw the scariest thing I had ever seen in my life. The house across the street was torn into pieces. It happened so quickly that if I had not looked up when I did, I would have completely missed it getting blown away. Debris went flying all over the place. Only moments after that, my bedroom window shattered as pieces of the house across the street flew into my home, hitting it all over. It took me a moment to realize what I was witnessing was the formation of a tornado, and it was right there across the street from me. I don't know how long I was on my bed trying to get over the shock of what I was seeing. I don't think I was thinking very much as it was going on. All I knew was that I had to get to our basement as quickly as possible. Part of me hesitated, thinking I should go out and check to see if the people who lived in the house I just saw get obliterated were okay, but that would involve me running outside into a tornado. As I was getting off my bed, getting my shoes on, because there was glass everywhere, I grabbed my laptop and ran into the other room. We had a fully finished underground basement, which I had always learned was the safest place to be during a tornado. It was then that I heard the tornado siren begin going off, which I would later reflect on that it was moments after I had just watched the house get destroyed. The power went out. I guess I should have mentioned that. I wasn't really thinking about it though. The basement was very, very dark. Fortunately, my laptop still had a bit of a charge on it, so it wasn't completely pitch black. I went over to a corner in the basement because I sort of remembered that being what I was supposed to do. I was terrified. I couldn't even tell you how much time had passed. Everything just went so fast. It was all so loud, hearing the siren and the wind, and what I assumed was the tornado. It sounded like a freight train was running through the center of my house. The basement didn't have any windows, so it was safe, but it made it impossible to know what was going on outside. I just cringed and waited for my house to fall down on me. When the storm finally settled down a bit, I worked up the nerve to go try and go back up to the first floor. I was actually really surprised. I was expecting my house to be completely destroyed, but it wasn't. It was a mess with broken windows and missing parts, extremely wet, but it wasn't completely destroyed. I checked outside. I saw several other houses were completely destroyed. Fortunately, it seemed there were no fatalities, just some injuries. My appreciation for storms waned after that. To this day, I can still pull up the image of that house being torn apart in front of me in my head. I am very fortunate to not have to know what it felt like to be inside that house at the time. I'm trying to think of the best way to tell this story. You would have to first know that when this story happened, I was really poor. Although I had enough money to rent a decent house, I didn't really have enough to keep it constantly repaired every time something went wrong with it. I should fall back on my landlord to take care of things like that, I know, but he was not exactly the handiest guy in the world. In fact, the reason that part of this story happened was because one of the bathrooms adjacent to my bedroom did not have a fan in it. After a while, the lack of this fan began to have more than one effect. The linoleum of the floor began to get weak. After a while, a hole actually opened up in the floor. It wasn't a huge hole or anything, but my roommate did get hurt once when his foot went through the floor. The thing that bothered me the most, though, was something else. One day when I was doing some rearranging in my bedroom, I needed to take a bit of a rest, so I sat down on the floor and leaned against the wall. Well, the wall turned out to be really soft in that one spot, since it was on the other side of the bathroom. The sheetrock caved in and left a hole with a diameter of 1.5 feet in the wall. Now, I had never patched up a wall before, just like I've never fixed a bathroom floor before. I decided that as annoying as these two things were, I would just have to try and live with them. And honestly, it wasn't too hard to do. I was able to put something in front of the hole so it wasn't too distracting. I put some boards down over the hole in the bathroom floor. For me, everything was fine. This began happening maybe a year after the hole in the wall was made. My bed sits on the back wall with the head of the bed on the wall the hole is on. I tend to do a lot of work on my bed. I'm sort of poor like I mentioned, and I don't have a lot of furniture yet. I have a stand with my computer on it that's between me and the hole in the wall. I have a stand with my computer on it that's between me and the hole in the wall. Well, there I was, just working on my computer one evening, when I suddenly got caught off guard by what sounded like a human cough in my bedroom. I hadn't turned the light on, so the only light I had was from my computer screen. I immediately tried to think of what that sound could have possibly been, but I couldn't come up with anything other than a human cough. It is really what it sounded like. I got up and turned on the light to look around. There was no one nor nothing in my room that could explain the sound I'd just heard. I decided it was best not to worry about it, and that it was likely just the house settling in. I didn't hear anything else weird that night, so I wrote it up as a figment of my imagination. It would not be the first time. The following night, I had forgotten all about that weird coughing noise. I was once again working on my computer in the dark. It caught me off guard again, of course, just like the night before. I tried my very best to explain it to myself what was going on. Maybe it was my hard drive making a strange sound? I'd only heard it twice, so I could be trying to just hear something that wasn't really there. About 20 minutes passed by, and by then I wasn't really listening for it anymore. I just went back to my work to distract myself, and that's when I heard it again. I couldn't figure out what it was, because once again it sounded just like a human being coughing, and it was sort of disturbing. I listened again, and once again a significant amount of time had passed where I came to the conclusion it must just have been something else. After that night, I didn't hear the noise again. It had still been making me feel on edge, make no mistake, but it was starting to slip my mind at that point. At one point, though, I heard something else. It sounded like something was moving around in my room somehow. It made me uneasy, especially after remembering the coughing noises. I picked up my phone and turned the flashlight on, shining it over at the area where the hole was. My heart skipped a beat when I saw some black, shapeless form over by the hole in the wall. It was by the hole, and then quickly moved inside of it and into the wall. I immediately got up and ran over to the light and flipped it on. I didn't do that often, but I was scared by what I had just seen. I went over to the hole, and very slowly and cautiously moved to look inside, scared as to what I might see. There was nothing there, just the emptiness between the two walls. I was scared, though. I didn't feel comfortable sleeping in that room that night. The next day, I went to Home Depot and bought something to patch the hole in the wall up. It was my first time ever doing that, and I made some mistakes as well, but I had to get it done after what I'd just seen. I was scared going forward, too, but after a while of not hearing that cough or seeing anything or hearing anything moving around again, I was eventually able to calm myself down. Ever since, I've gotten better at being in there alone. I never experienced anything weird or terrifying like that again, but I'll always patch up any future holes right away now.
Hey everyone. So I'm a guy from the UK. I live in a town in Wales, albeit not the little villages most people imagine. My town is a popular holiday destination right along the coast of Wales. This isn't overly relevant to the story, but I just thought I'd give everyone some context for the location. I actually did post this story on a separate Reddit account several years ago in a different subreddit. However, I had highly exaggerated it for the sake of story. This was a creative writing subreddit, after all. I can't fully remember. I just remember the story I told then wasn't totally honest. So if you think you've read something similar before, well, you probably have. This is the full truth of what happened, and is likely way less exciting than the original story, but, well. So, it started when I was around 15 years old, so about 8 years ago. I was dating a girl from about 2 towns over. I would usually get the train to hers and back. However, this one night, her family weren't supposed to be home, and we were kind of being watched by her brother, who was about 19 to 20 and was very chill. The plan was to stay the night. We were up late playing on the Wii, but her parents unexpectedly came home. I never got along with their mother, and the whole thing got kind of heated. I was kicked out of the house and told I couldn't stay over. It was about 2 a.m., and I didn't want to call my own parents and worry of waking them up. My mother is a very strict woman, so I began the long trudge home. It was roughly about an hour and a quarter worth of walking, so I was expecting to be home by about 4:30. So I walked along the weird concrete bit just above the beach. Not sure what it's called. I stopped after about a half an hour of walking, as there was a public toilet which was kind of run down. It was also open 24 hours though, and I was getting pretty desperate. I was expecting it to be empty, or to just have a homeless dude sleeping in it. But I was wrong. There was a man using the urinal. This man looked to be in his mid to late 50s, maybe. A little on the overweight side, but not extremely. He had gray, messy-ish hair, but other than that, he looked to be a very normal guy. He definitely didn't look homeless. I remember he made a quick joke about something, but I don't remember what. I politely laughed, did my business, and left. After about another 15 minutes of walking, the weather had gotten extremely bad. It started to rain heavily, and the wind was picking up. I seem to remember this was around November time, so it was very cold as well. Anyways, I was walking and a car drives by, beeps and pulls over just in front of me. I assumed that it was someone I knew, but couldn't think of who it could be. When I got to the car, I saw that the dude from the toilet was inside. He asked me where I was headed to, and I told him. He said that was a long walk and I couldn't be expected to walk all that way in this weather. He offered me a lift. In hindsight, I probably should have refused, but the weather was very bad, and at the time he wasn't giving off any creepy vibes. The drive took about 15 minutes, I think, maybe 20. The more I was in the car with him, the more I started to get vibes that there was something strange about this guy. He was telling me about his best friend, who was a 14-year-old lad who stayed over at his place a lot, that they'd drink together, and if I ever wanted to join, I was welcome to come. He was asking me some really invasive questions as well. I don't fully remember what they were. I just kind of remember it's not the sort of questions you'd ask someone you're giving a simple lift home to. Anyways, we got to the street around the corner from my place. I asked him to just drop me off there. I told him that my house wasn't accessible by road, and that I would walk the rest of the way. He gave me his number and told me to ring him when I got back to my house safely, as he wanted to make sure I got home okay. I asked him what his name was, as at this point I had told him my full name, and he just said Pete. Pete what? My phone wants a surname. He wouldn't tell me. He just kept saying, "Call me Pete." I later found out that Pete was a fake name too. I got into my house and texted him, just to let him know that I was home safe. Probably a bad decision, but back then I was just full of them, to be honest. The next day came and I was expecting everything to just go right back to normal. It didn't, because I stupidly gave Pete my number when I texted him. I started to get texts from him every morning, basically just saying good morning to me and wishing me well. I replied to the first few, and then I started to ignore them. He then started trying to ring me, every single night. I would ignore most of his calls, but he would often repeatedly ring over and over until I finally answered. He was always sending me these texts, inviting me over to his house for drinks. He kept telling me he'd just gotten himself a pool table and wanted me to come and play it with him. He was telling me a story of a friend he was playing pool with, the 14-year-old I was talking about, and accidentally let slip that the guy called him John. I collared him about this and said, "I thought your name was Pete." "Oh no, my friend's name is John." "You just said your friend called you John, and you told me your friend was called Tom." "Oh, well, some people call me John. It's just a nickname, but his name is John too." He hesitated saying this, and it kind of clicked that he was just feeding me a bunch of lies. I kept refusing, but he kept asking. After a while, my mom wanted to know who this dude who kept texting me and ringing me was. I told her, and she rang him herself from her phone and told him that if he carried on texting and ringing me, she would be calling the police. I didn't get any more texts from him after that, but it didn't just end there. I had a routine, you see, and he knew it. I always walked my dog at 3:30 every afternoon, and played with her for about 40 minutes on the field at the end of my street, just near where he had dropped me off. I started to notice after a while that his car was pulling up there within 5 minutes of me getting there with my dog. He had tinted windows, but I would always notice the car lights were always left on and the engine was always running. By then, I could recognize his car. I would occasionally notice the car door open and a large flash from that direction, as if someone was taking pictures. I started changing the time I walked my dog, but he would always figure it out and start showing up either later or earlier to coincide with when I was walking her. This went on for months, and I never mentioned it to anyone, but one day it just suddenly stopped. He stopped pulling up at the side of the field. I never saw his car after that. No text messages or phone calls from him. It all just stopped. I ended up getting a new phone after about a year, and had that for another 2 years. I dug my old phone out when I was around 18 or 19, after my aforementioned dog had just died. I had some old pictures and videos of her on that phone, and wanted to transfer them over to my PC so that I always had them. I turned on a phone which had been turned off for several years now, and still had the old SIM in it. That's when I got my final message from Pete. It was an odd one, just about 14 months old. It said something along the lines of, "Hi, I know we haven't spoken in a while, but I just thought you should know that over New Year, I was diagnosed with an illness, and I've been told I don't have long left to live. You were a good friend in the short time we knew each other. I live at," sent me his address, "and would really appreciate it if you could come around, just so I could have one last chat with you. I've got some beers in, and if it gets too late, you can just stay the night. Just drop me a phone call when you want me to come around, so that I can get everything ready for you. See you soon." I have no idea if Pete/John was genuinely ill, or was just trying to lure me to his house. I've never been to the address he sent me, and never responded to him or heard from him since. I didn't reply to him, and after that text was the last I'd ever heard from the guy. So, yeah, that's the story. It's not tremendously exciting, but it kind of had a big impact on me during those years. So I hope you all enjoyed. I attended a pretty awful university in the UK. In fact, it was so awful that Vice even published an article written by a student that attended the same time as me. It was titled, "3 Years of Hell at the University of Wolverhampton." I'll post a link at the end of my story for anyone wishing to see proof of just how terrible this place is. I lived in a student building in the middle of the city, one of the 3 student buildings available. It was the middle choice. Literally, it was situated right in the middle of the 3, and also figuratively it was the middle as well. Not as fancy as the fancy one, not as unbearable as the worst one. Most of my friends lived in the fancy building. To get there, I had to walk a small trek through a residential part of the city, but my friends had found a shortcut. You could actually cut through and climb up at the back of a garden behind an abandoned house to get there in less than half the time. I started using this shortcut all the time. One morning, I walked around towards the garden and down to my shortcut when I found 3 grown men standing there. They all looked, for lack of a better word, thuggish and large. I uttered a small surprised, "Oh," when I saw them, and they all turned to look up at me. A pale 19-year-old gay country boy with a blonde mohawk. I think I apologized for barging in on what I was pretty sure was a drug deal. I turned to walk back the way I came, and take the long way around. As I walked away, one of them shouted to get my attention. I ignored them as best I could. When I heard them coming after me, I started to run. I was much younger, slimmer, and fitter back in those days, so I managed to outrun them pretty easily and sprinted all the way around the long route to my friend's building, where they let me in. I explained to them what had happened, and nobody was surprised at all. This was Wolverhampton, after all. A few minutes later, a friend of ours finally arrived. He lived in a non-university student building off campus and had to walk a different way to get to where we were. He arrived and asked me, "Kyle, what did you do?" I asked him why he had said that, and he said that an enormous man had come up to him and asked if he'd seen a guy with a blonde mohawk. My friend acted dumb, even though he immediately knew who he'd been talking about. My poor choice of hair was fairly distinct. The worst part, the man was carrying a brick in his hand. Still gives me shivers all these years later. But it doesn't end there. Me and my friends went for a day out to Birmingham. Bright lights, big city, whatever. We didn't get home until late at night. We got back to their building and drank until way after midnight. I started to relax a bit and forget my horrible ordeal from earlier that morning. At some point, more than a little bit drunk, I decided to head home. I was now pretty sure I would never take the shortcut again, so I took the long way home instead. As I was walking through the residential area, a car stopped on the opposite side of the road. There were two men inside the car, and the car was filled with smoke and stank of weed when they rolled down the window to speak to me. I didn't have headphones in or anything, and I was the only person on the street, so I couldn't just ignore them or pretend I couldn't hear them. "Nice hair," the driver said. His friend sniggered. "Oi, mate, do you know where we could get some food?" "I don't know, in the city center?" I said. I kept walking, trying not to show them how unnerved I was. They were facing the wrong way to drive alongside me, so the driver put the car in reverse so they could keep pace with me. "Do you know any places?" "A few. There's a kebab place at the top of the road." "Get in and show us, yeah?" "I'm drunk and tired, and I've got lectures in the morning." I tried to sound casual, even though I was just about ready to pee my pants. It hadn't been a very good day. "We're going to turn around and come back to pick you up. Wait there, yeah?" As the car started towards the end of the road, which was a dead end, to turn around, I heard the passenger say, "It's him. I knew it was him." When the car was far enough away, I broke into a sprint and ran back towards my building. I stumbled down some stairs and twisted my ankle pretty badly, but managed to limp the rest of the way. I got through the front door just as the car drove past. I dread to think what could have happened that day. For the rest of my time at that god-awful university, I prayed to never meet any of those guys again. Fortunately, I never did. This summer, I traveled alone to Colombia. I stayed with a host family in Cartagena and met a girl from Brazil named Maria, who was also staying there. Maria and I quickly became friends and started doing as many touristy activities as we could during the day and partying together all night. One afternoon, we were researching day trips for the weekend when we came across the island of San Andres. We immediately fell in love with its beauty and booked a trip there for Saturday. When we got there, everything was great. We swam in the ocean, ate great food, and had an amazing time with the other people in our hostel. While we were exploring the town, we got sucked in by a tour agency and spent all of our money booking tours like parasailing, boating out to the smaller islands, and the like. One of the activities we decided to try was scuba diving, despite neither of us having a license. The tour agency said it would be fine, because we wouldn't go very deep, and a licensed professional would be with us the whole time. So we woke up early the next morning, and got picked up in a van with a driver, a scuba instructor, and a family from Spain. The driver took us to a secluded spot on the island. Now, this was a small island, like super hard to avoid people, but this spot didn't even have any locals. The whole time we were there, maybe 3 cars at most drove past. Anyway, the instructor, Jose, gave us directions and safety tips in 3 different languages, and then took the family to dive while Maria and I waited for our turn. After they'd left, Maria turned to me and started telling me that she didn't trust Jose. She told me that while they were speaking in Portuguese, he'd made some strange comments about our swimsuits. We were both wearing bikinis, and were both young, and I suppose fairly attractive women. When she told him that neither of us had boyfriends, he was very insistent that Maria and I must be a couple then. I shrugged it off as a cultural thing, and told her that it would be fine. Our turn to dive finally rolled around, and we hopped into the water with him. I realized immediately that this was more of an intermediate than a beginner dive, but it didn't really bother me. I was excited to see the coral and fish. I could tell it made Maria very nervous, though. She wasn't exactly a strong swimmer anyway, and Jose was putting her on edge. At first, it was fun. We were swimming, and Jose was taking pictures for us on his GoPro. But then he started grabbing us strangely, touching our breasts and making it seem like an accident. Again, I didn't really think anything of it, because we were underwater and it was his job to make sure we stayed close to him. But it was enough to freak Maria out and immediately end her dive. Maria got out of the water, but I was having a fantastic time and didn't really want to leave just yet. I stayed with Jose, just the 2 of us. He took me to a different spot on the reef, and we ended up swimming past all the coral into the open ocean. I was really curious what I would see there. At this point, we were probably about 80 feet or 24 meters deep, which is just ridiculous for someone without a diving license. We'd gotten pretty good at non-verbal communication at this point, and it was like I could read his mind. He took some pictures of me with the GoPro in open water, and I was excited to show my friends what a daredevil I was. After a while, I started to get tired and decided to head back, and that's when he grabbed me. He started gesturing to me, and from what I understood, he was not going to let me leave until I kissed him. Now, Jose was probably about 40, and I was 18 at the time. Plus, I had a boyfriend who Maria didn't know about. Honestly, I don't really think I need to justify why kissing a complete stranger underwater would gross me out. That's just fucking weird. But I was starting to get this gut feeling that I should go with what he told me. I laughed and gave him a kiss on the cheek, which he not so sneakily photographed. He looked me in the eyes and shook his head no. I could tell he was starting to get agitated. He took my air tube away until I kissed him on the mouth. He repeatedly did this until he got everything he wanted, photographing and all. My gut was screaming that the only way this would end was by me being drowned, so I improvised. I pretended to be into it for a while, and then I looked behind him and got the widest eyes. The goal was to make him think that I saw something dangerous. It worked. He turned around, and I swam away as fast as I could. Eventually I got to the surface and popped my head up. To my absolute horror, we were super far away from the shore. Jose surfaced next to me, and in kind of an irritated voice asked me what I saw. He insisted it was safe to go back down if I wanted to finish the dive. By some miracle, Maria saw us and started waving. I waved back to her and started swimming that way. I guess Jose knew his plan was fucked once Maria saw me alive. He sighed and headed back with me. On the drive back, I was super quiet, and Maria immediately knew something was wrong. I typed out everything that had happened and showed it to her. She was furious. We ended up buying the pictures Jose took on the GoPro to try and use them as evidence, but he only sent us the ones from earlier on in the dive. Honestly, it makes me sick thinking he probably still jacks off with them. We tried to contact the police, but of course they didn't care. Jose is still out there, and I hope whoever dives with him is smarter than I was.
I have a few creepy stories, but I'll start with this one since it was the most dangerous. One night, my boyfriend and I were out drinking and hanging out with our friends, and went back to our other friend's apartment. They lived about 10 to 15 minutes away from us, in the next town over. It was getting pretty late into the night, and we both had work the next day, so we called an Uber to come pick us up. So our Uber gets there. At first, everything is fine. We make casual small talk, as you tend to do with Ubers or Lyfts. The vibe was pretty nice. The dude seemed nice enough, nothing too much to worry about. I was completely exhausted, and I just really wanted to get home. I remember just this feeling of jolting wide awake out of nowhere. We get to the end of this street. I recognize it as being close-ish to our homes. While I'm really bad at directions, this was a turn where it was like, you turn right, you're going towards our homes. You turn left, and you're clearly driving in the opposite direction. This guy gets to the stoplight and flicks his left blinker on. I immediately started looking around and looked to my boyfriend, who had also been put on edge. My boyfriend asked the driver where he was going because it was clearly the wrong way. He told my boyfriend not to worry. He was from the area and knew a shortcut. Whatever, we both relaxed a little bit, especially because this was a main road and there were plenty of side streets around that he could have been cutting through. He gets to another stoplight and has the ability to either make a right, which would put him going towards the general direction where we lived, or left, which was starting to go to the direction of the next town over. He flicked his left blinker on again, and at this point I looked over. I noticed that his Uber app and GPS tracking was totally turned off. His entire phone was off, in fact, so there was nothing tracking his driving or location, and he was no longer being monitored by the app. My heart started beating. I got out my phone to call 911 and my car keys because I have this shiv-like stabby weapon thing as a keychain. Stay strapped, sisters. My boyfriend flies out of his seat and lunges toward the front seat. He was half standing up and started yelling, asking the guy where the fuck he was going because we knew he was going the wrong way. The guy immediately flicked his right blinker on instead and skirted into the right lane instead of the left where he had previously been. He tried to apologize over and over again. My boyfriend just said, "You know what? Never mind. We're gonna get out right here. This far is fine, so please unlock the doors." When he went to unlock the doors, the driver freaked out, got really defensive and on edge. He was saying these weird things like, "I'm sorry, I promise I'll take you home now. I'm going the right way right now, so I'm sorry, buddy, I got you." He basically admitted he was trying to take us in the totally wrong direction. I can't remember if we just rode the rest of the way in that Uber, because there were likely no other ones around at that hour, and we felt like we called the guy out enough that he wouldn't try anything, or if we actually got out and began to walk home. Like I said, it was a very exhausting drunk night. The most chilling part about this for me was how he had his app off and how quick he was to correct himself as soon as we noticed something was up. Like he didn't even try to come up with a cover story to justify his actions. He admitted that before my boyfriend freaked him out, he was not taking us to our destination. We reported that guy the next day on the Uber app and have never come into contact with him since. I don't know what he was planning, but I pray to whoever is up there that he didn't have an opportunity to scare anyone else like this ever again. This all happened in August of 2017. I was 23 years old at the time, and had just moved back into my mom's place, which happened to be about 30 minutes from my nearest friend's house. My car had broken down, so I was Ubering pretty much everywhere I had to go. I went down to my friend's place to help them move, went to Target to grab some champagne and orange juice because I apparently hated myself, and thought an imminent hangover sounded like a really great idea. Fast forward to that night. Of course, I'm doubled over throwing up with a migraine and can barely lift my head. I had to work the next day's morning shift as well. My friends have no idea where they have any sort of over-the-counter meds for headaches. But of course, the stoner of the house offers me an edible. Now, I may have killed the bottle of champagne, but I hadn't touched marijuana in years. I ate half of that edible and waited about 45 minutes to feel better. Then I called my Uber. I was getting picked up in an apartment complex, and of course had to walk to the front to find the driver, because I've never met an Uber driver that can locate an address with any accuracy. I hop in the back seat, and he turns around to introduce himself. This guy had a southern drawl that would make molasses seem like water. It was at this moment I realized I fucked up. I told him I had a migraine and just wanted to go home. He pulled out a bottle of water that had already been opened and some random pills and told me these should make me feel much better. Of course, I politely grabbed them and then proceeded to stuff them into the seat and shove the water bottle in the pocket in front of me. We began our 30-minute journey to my mom's apartment. If it weren't for Mary Jane coming along for the ride, I probably would have hopped out right then. The guy started off the drive telling me his prison stories. Then somehow it delved into how the world was going to end by December 20-something of 2017. Every few sentences, he now started bringing up his bunker. He asked me constantly if I wanted to head there instead of home. My high-ass self thought the best thing to do was tell him that I'd love to, but I had work so I can't. Maybe next time, I guess. He was cycling through these conspiracies, from the earth is flat to Kandahar, Afghanistan giants. He leaned over and whispered to me, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but look up Kandahar, Afghanistan on YouTube. Also, in case y'all didn't know this, the world ain't heliocentric, just get a pair of binoculars and you'll see. At some point, he's telling me that he has an arsenal of guns, he grows opium at his bunker, and asked me to come with him. I was panicked, texting everyone I know, sharing my location, and even started recording. I managed to get about 7 minutes in total of this 30-minute drive on film. We were getting closer and closer to the exit he needed to take to drop me off. He was still in the far left lane of this 4-lane highway. I kept telling him to move over. The exit was coming up. This creepy-ass fucker kept telling me how well-stocked his bunker was. And then he missed my exit. I finally lost it and started screaming at him to get me home. My mom was waiting for me, and I had work tomorrow. Like my job means anything to this psycho, or even to me. He finally did get off the exit after I started kicking his seat and threatening to jump out of the moving car. I ran out of his car so fast when we hit the red light outside the apartment complex. As soon as I got inside, I tried telling my mom what happened, but she brushed it off and was more disappointed that I told her I had taken an edible. The next morning, I coherently explained what actually happened and showed her the videos of the drive. We both reported him to Uber. I still do take Ubers on occasion, but I'll never use one while alone or inebriated ever again. This is also the reason I don't consume THC. The universe knows when I'm high, and just loves to make things like this happen to me. I work in food service front of house, so in the early days of the pandemic with the restaurants closed, I was taking work pretty much wherever I could find it. An old friend clued me into a medical office that needed someone to come in and do a bit of light filing. I was able to go in at night to limit direct contact with people, so I jumped at the opportunity right away. Ironically, the medical office job had been the safest I'd been offered so far COVID-wise. I wanted to avoid the bus if I could due to crowds, so I decided to swing for a rideshare app. It's not all that expensive in my area, and I really didn't want to catch the virus. I headed in at almost 3 a.m., because it was after the cleaning crew had already left. I was kicking myself for being so cautious, though, because I was really exhausted. I stumbled onto the block looking for my ride, and to my tired self's great relief, the car spotted me almost immediately and pulled up alongside me asking, "Uber?" I had been cluelessly wandering up and down the street searching. The ride was taking a while, but I'd only just moved here last year, so I wasn't too familiar with all of the surrounding areas, and I didn't think much of the long ride time. I was pretty alert at first, so was trying to pass the time playing games on my phone and stuff, but the car didn't have a compatible phone charger, and I wasn't sure the building would have one either, so I wanted to save my battery to be able to call a ride back. I shut my phone down into airplane mode, and eventually drifted off from a combination of tiredness and boredom. Now, I don't often take rideshare, so being alone with a strange driver often put me a bit on edge, but this guy had a pretty boring car and a very standard look to him. He actually looked a little bit like my brother even. Young, clean-kept, listening to jazz. Nothing that screamed, "You need to micromanage this trip." When we arrived, the driver tried to wake me up by calling to me from the front, but I was in too deep of a sleep and couldn't fully distinguish it from a dream. Finally, he awkwardly jimmied my leg to wake me up and kept saying, Ma'am, we're here now." I was so embarrassed that I'd been so out of it, I just gave a hurried thanks and booked it out of the car and into the building. As I looked around, though, I began to realize it was nothing what I had expected out of an office park. I had seen a street view of the building when I first looked at the business, and it had appeared to be a strip mall plaza. And the further I went, the more loudly alarm bells were ringing in my gut. This structure was semi-dilapidated and was pitch black dark past the entryway. I expected at least some lights to be off in the nighttime, but not the entire building. I skittered across the concrete foundation comprising what was left of the lobby area and told myself they must just be renovating. I followed signs for the stairs. After what felt like ages but was likely just a few minutes, all I had passed was construction equipment, a couple locked doors, and a lot of smashed windows. I was certain I was not going to find a medical office here, and figured maybe I'd mixed up the address on accident. I took out my phone to double check, but once I got it out of airplane mode, I could barely get a signal. I kept moving around the building, pacing, looking for a stronger one. I eventually confirmed in my text that I had written down the correct address just by scrolling back, which didn't require service. Since I had only been inside for a few minutes at most, I figured I should try and get in touch with the driver, because if I'd entered the correct address, then it was only fair that he should continue my ride to the correct place, and save me the additional fees of calling a second trip, considering this was his mix-up after all. The app was taking forever to load with my slow service, but before I could get to a cloud of reception, I heard a rustling sound in the lower level of the building. I was on the top floor, and the only stairwell I was aware of was the one I had taken up, so that would force me into the middle of the building. There was no way to exit this situation without encountering whoever was downstairs. In an abandoned building, in the latest hours of the night, I figured chances were pretty high that it was a tweaker, and I had no desire to try slipping past one of those, especially when it was late enough that they were probably on something, so already jumpy and on edge. I tried to get a text out to a group of friends with my address, and a request to call 911 to help get me from the property, because I didn't feel safe walking in that neighborhood at night and didn't have enough reception to call a new ride, but the message just wouldn't send. The reception was too weak even for that. I gave up on getting my phone going, and started checking for another stairwell or even a window with balconies or dumpsters that could be used to exit the second floor as a last resort, in the event that whoever was downstairs decided to come up. I scrambled over to a door with a stairs sign on it, but those stairs were completely dilapidated, and it was essentially a completely straight drop down to the first floor. At this point, the worst-case scenario began to unfold. I heard whoever was downstairs begin making their way up. I thought fast and figured based on my walkabout, the floor was basically one giant loop. I would have to wait for whoever this was to come up the stairs, wait for them to come all the way up, and then sprint the opposite direction of wherever they were going, and try to get down the stairs and out of the building in time to make it to the road, without ever encountering them. I wasn't exactly anticipating being chased or anything, but I didn't want to piss off a druggie or have a homeless person who might be living there feel as though I'd trespassed and become hostile toward me. I really just didn't want to have any sort of interaction that could possibly occur at that hour in an abandoned industrial park. I held my breath for what felt like 5 minutes, but was likely closer to 30 seconds. The person appeared at the top of the stairs. To my great relief, I saw it was just the Uber driver. I figured he had come back for me, realizing he had left me at the wrong place, a place that could have worked out to be dangerous. I came out from the beam I was hidden behind and started to wave him down, but then I processed. There was no way for him to realize this had been the wrong address. My stomach lurched forward, and my blood chilled the slush. I made eye contact with him very briefly. He was completely calm and composed, but breathing heavily and blocking the stairwell down. On a normal, rational day, as an outside observer, I could think of a dozen innocent reasons he might have returned. But in that moment, standing across from him, I knew in my gut that this was someone with ill intent. I can't remember much more from the ensuing few minutes. Operating solely on muscle memory and instinct, I Superman dove for the second stairwell's opening and just let myself fall down the drop. Thankfully, I don't think he'd seen where I'd gone at first, and though I was in too much pain to know it then, plenty was bruised but nothing had broken. I scrambled up and threw myself at anything that seemed like it could be a door. It was too dark to tell. I was disoriented from the fall, and I wasn't in a calm enough mindset to think to use my phone flashlight. Plus, in hindsight, some part of me probably knew it would call too much attention to my location. Just before I was able to reach the door, it flew open with a blinding light beaming straight into my eyes. My first thought, though not totally coherent, was, there's another one of these guys. Damn! I stumbled backward, trying to find something to hide behind. Before I could, though, a strong voice called out, "All right, this is the Name of Town Police Department. Everyone get on your knees with your hands in the air." I didn't believe it was the police at first. I was in such fight or flight mode I had already committed to flight that I continued looking for ways to get out. But he kept shining the flashlight right at me as I teetered around and yelled, "Hey, I said on the ground, right now! Hands out! Hands out where I can see them!" He sounded so authoritative that I just automatically did exactly as he asked. He approached me and shined the flashlight away from me. It took a second to get my night vision, but once I did, I could see he really was an officer. I tried to explain what was happening, but first he started asking me all these questions, and that combined with what just happened, and the fear of my driver coming back, snowballed into being unable to form a single articulate sentence. He even was asking easy questions too, like, "What's your name? Would you rather talk here or outside?" In my total stunned babbling in response, it led him to believe I was on something. He directed me out to his car, and once I was safely out of the building, I was able to start getting my bearings just a little. I sat on the edge of the back seat of the squad car with the door open facing out, while he stood across from me and asked those same questions again. The first thing I could think to ask was, "Did my friends call you? What did they tell you?" He explained that no, nobody had called him. He was patrolling the area and noticed a car idling outside the building that's known to be condemned. Nobody was supposed to be inside, and usually when they were up to no good. He was launching into a speech about how if I'd gone to shoot up or meet a John, he had resources that could direct me to help, and it was not an ideal place to do either of those things, as it was dangerous. He started asking me if I had somewhere safe to stay the night, but I was stuck on something else he'd said. Finally, it clicked. The car. I spilled my whole rideshare story in a frantic word vomit. He looked around, but the car wasn't there anymore. The officer guessed the guy had driven off while we were talking inside the building. He asked me all the details I remembered, and I told him, but there weren't many. I'd been too tired when the ride started to track much. Thankfully, the officer realized I could pull up my app on Uber and get all the information. There wasn't really enough reception there, even outdoors, so we sped down the road. Once I had enough bars, the app roared to life. I saw I had 4 missed notifications from Uber. "Hello? I've arrived. I don't see you. Can you confirm the pickup address is correct? I'm flashing my hazards." And finally, "Unfortunately, your driver had to cancel." At first, I thought the driver was so cunning as to pick me up while sending these fake messages and canceling so the GPS wouldn't track us, knowing I wouldn't notice because I was asleep with my phone off. But instead, I checked the car details. I checked again. It was definitely not the same driver. The person who'd driven me there had not been my Uber. My driver was somewhere else on the street when this guy pulled up to me. The policeman took my statement and said they would keep an eye out for the man. The best I could give them to go off of, though, was basically young Caucasian man with brown hair. which is like 1 out of every 4 guys in the city. I feel blessed to have survived this near miss though. Suffice it to say, I do not take rideshare services anymore. Quadruple check your license plate and driver name. You just never know. A few years back, when I was 17 years old, I went to a party. Everything was alright until the host started getting really intense and creepy. By that point, it was around 3 a.m., and I was pretty drunk. I decided to call an Uber in order to avoid any advances from the insistent guy. The Uber showed up. I tried to sober up when I got in. The driver started making small talk with me, and in the state I was in, I failed to see the red flags. He started to ask me about the party I was at. I told him about the creep, but he just told me it was because I was short and cute. He then asked my age. Sensing a weird vibe from him, I told him I was a minor, thinking that would deter any further advances. It turned out that was a horrible idea. He was driving pretty recklessly on the highway, and I snapped out of my drunken stupor real fast. He then asked me to go get drinks with him that same night and told me he really liked me. I quickly told him I'd get grounded if I stayed out any later, and my mother was awake and waiting for me at home. Keep in mind I lived in Mexico, and the amount of people, and especially women, that get murdered daily is ridiculously high. When we got to my home address, I noticed the doors were locked. He kept insisting on us going to get a drink, even though by now it was almost 4 a.m. I tried to act as nice as possible when I told him I couldn't that night. He then asked for my phone number and told me we could go out the next day. Not being the first time some creep had asked me for my number in a situation like this, I gave him my number but changed the last digit so he wouldn't actually be able to contact me. Then he actually dialed the phone as I was getting out of the car. Of course, my phone didn't ring. He started getting agitated and said I'd given him the wrong number. I played drunk and stupid and recited my number again, but actually said it correctly in order for him to think he heard the last number wrong. He chuckled and said it was his bad and told me we'd see each other the next day. I made my way into my house and immediately woke my mom up because I was terrified. She managed to calm me down and told me to go to sleep. I went into my bedroom and started putting my pajamas on when I heard my phone ringing. The Uber driver was trying to video call me. I lost my shit when I saw that on my screen. I immediately denied the call and then noticed he'd sent me about 15 messages asking what time he could come pick me up and why I wasn't replying. Of course, I blocked him right away and thought that would be the end of it. Well, the very next day, I got a text from an unknown number. I checked the picture and saw it was the driver. He asked why I'd blocked him and started spamming me. Immediately, I blocked him again. Over the course of the next month, I'd get messages from all these random phone numbers. It quickly became obvious it was the driver. I would always block him, but eventually I reported him on the Uber app and changed my number. My only problem is, I'm worried that he knows where I live.
Today's video may contain subject matter that some viewers may be sensitive to, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. And if you have a scary story you'd like to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button to do so. And thank you. I have a story from when I was young that is 100% true, but I honestly have no way to prove it, and I'd guess that a lot of people won't believe it. Obviously, you can use it if you want to. I just want to tell someone the story that might believe it, or at least enjoy it. So, here goes. When I was around 12, my best buddy, Jordan, and I used to spend a lot of time out of the house. Like, a lot of the time we would go to school, and the minute we got off the bus, we would go in, drop off our book bags, and then would be out in the woods until almost 9, or whenever our parents yelled for us. We would typically skip dinner because we were both young nature enthusiasts and genuinely loved spending a lot of time out on the trails. Thankfully, Jordan had an excellent sense of direction and could almost always get us home without issues. Me, on the other hand, I was so bad at figuring out where we were that I could walk 20 feet to the north of where the forest started and be completely lost. I liked bugs and trees though, so I was always all for it. Now, all of that explains what I loved about being in the woods with Jordan and how we always had a good time. However, there was a stretch where things weren't quite so fun or comfortable. This happened back in the 80s. I don't remember when exactly, but like I said, I was around 12 or possibly 13. I remember it was in October because all of the trees were a bright red-orange, and it was my favorite time of the year. If you've never seen a Midwestern fall in the middle of the woods, I highly recommend it. The trees were all covered in oranges, reds, and yellows, and the ground plants were starting to die off, so it was a major contrast between the dead tan and the colorful trees. The first time that I knew something was off was one of the random trips that we took out into the woods. We were playing and it was starting to get pretty dark pretty early by then. I think we were pretending to be soldiers or something, which is what we typically did, and were stealthily treading through enemy territory. We were hiding behind trees and splitting up to take down the base when I remember hearing something in one of the trees. At first I thought it was just a squirrel, and I looked up to see if I could find it, but I didn't see what it was. I ignored it, and I moved back on with what we were playing. After a few more minutes of doing this, I remember I heard a branch above me snapping and thinking, dang, that must be a fat squirrel. But when I looked again, the thing that I saw was not a squirrel. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but I remember laughing because I looked over at Jordan and said, "Hey, is that a monkey?" Which was a dumb question. I live in the Midwest, and we very clearly do not have monkeys here. We both kind of stood there and just stared at it, but we couldn't figure out what it was. Because it wasn't really moving, just standing in the trees looking away from us, and swaying back and forth. And by swaying, I think the best way to describe it is like a praying mantis. If you've ever seen a praying mantis that feels threatened, they kind of sway back and forth. It was like that. We just watched it for several moments, and then we tried to kind of walk around the tree to see the front of this thing, but as soon as it noticed us, it ran up the tree and hid to the point that we couldn't find it again. We made plans to come back up the next day and try to see if we could figure out what this thing was, because I was stumped. I was pretty well versed in most of the fauna of our area, because that's what I was really into at the time. But this thing was weird. The only thing I could seriously think that it looked like was a monkey of some sort. I asked my parents that night if there were any monkeys or apes around us, just to be absolutely certain, and they confirmed that there weren't. Well, aside from the zoo. Obviously, no one had heard anything about an escaped animal from the zoo on the news, so I was back to just being stumped. The next day, Jordan and I brought our binoculars to see if we could get a better view trying to spot this thing. We didn't do much beyond just sitting on a log and watching the trees, seeing if this thing came back. And it did. But it kind of seemed like it was trying to avoid the area that we were waiting in. So it was like it was aware of us. more than something like, say, a squirrel or a rodent or whatever. It wasn't until the fourth day of us staking out the woods that we actually got to see this thing clearly. It was a Saturday, so we had the entire day to stake out the area and see if we could find it. And, much to our surprise, when we got into the woods in the morning, we did see it. Except this time, it wasn't in the trees. We walked into the wooded area, and no more than 100 feet or so, this thing was on the ground. It looked like it was eating something like a hedge apple because it was smashing it into the ground and peeling it apart. We went into full stealth mode and crouched behind some of the brush and crept really slowly over to the side so that we could see this thing. This is where everything went from this fun, what is this thing that we're seeing, straight to, I wish we would have never seen this. Whatever this thing was, it was definitely ape-like in structure, but its face looked way too human. If you've ever seen a shaved ape, they do have faces similar to humans, but they're discernible. This thing was not. It had a human's face. It was structured like a person. There was nothing there that resembled an animal at all. The mouth was flattened down more like a person's, the nose protruded at an angle like a human's, and the eyes were inset like a human's. We watched this thing eat the hedge apple, and then slowly creep up the tree and climb out of sight. After that, I told Jordan that I wanted to go home, and he agreed. Something about seeing this thing, it triggered some kind of deeply inset fear that neither of us had ever experienced up to that point. It was like our brains knew that this thing was not natural at all, and it wanted us to block it out and never think about it again. We actually took a few weeks off from going into the woods, mostly because we didn't want to run into this thing. We did eventually get the courage to go back, but we never saw it again. I have no idea what the hell it was, but it was definitely not your standard animal from around my part of the world. And the fact that it switched on some kind of primal fear, it was just terrifying. I'm actually glad that we never saw it again, and I'm glad I was able to get this out because thinking about this creature, it sends shivers down my spine, and it almost makes me feel that same level of terror even this many years down the road. I used to live in a pretty small town with my grandparents around 2013. I had my little girl, Summer, at the time of this event. She had just turned 5. I'd split up with my ex, so they agreed to let me move in with them while I finished my degree and found a better job. He wasn't too fond of being a father figure, and after finding out that he spent more time with his ex than looking for a job, I was pretty over it. I didn't want to be the one paying for everything as well as taking care of our kid while he got to spend my money. The only downside was that when I say it was a small town, I mean small. They have one grocery store, which is also their pharmacy, and the town clinic is across the street. They have 2 gas stations, but everyone agrees that one is better than the other. And the most exciting thing to happen there was that they got a pizza buffet that also delivered. So, if you needed to go anywhere, it would take a few hours to get into town, get your stuff, and get back. Needless to say, it was easy to get bored. Summer was pretty occupied, though, as my grandma watched her during the day, but I felt bad that I didn't often get to go out and do anything with her, so when I learned a nearby town was having a small Halloween festival, I knew that I wanted to take her there. It turned out to be like a cute little carnival. They had a few small rides, like the ones that went in a circle, a kiddie roller coaster type thing, and they even had games. They had a hayride, a small spooky haunted house as they called it. It was the first one that she would be going to, so I was ready to do anything that she wanted. I will say that I definitely had that first kid syndrome, where I was very protective over everything and anything she did. I think we were both pretty clingy because of it. So I always had my eyes on her, and I didn't let her get too close to anyone that I didn't know. I brought the stroller, knowing she would probably get tired, and that way, while we were walking, I could at least have her in my sights at all times. She did great for the most part, too. There were a few times that she wanted to walk, but she knew that she had to stand next to me with her hand on the stroller, basically like she was pushing it with me, which was fine. We could toss her baby doll into the seat and she's set. So, she got around to a few games and treats, and had a few people approach me, mentioning how cute she was. We were getting towards the end because she was starting to get a little cranky. She didn't want to walk anymore, but she also didn't want to sit, thinking that she was going to miss out on something. Before we left, we stopped at one of the restrooms in the food area where we had to leave the strollers and wagons outside because the entrance was too narrow. So, when we left the restroom, I grabbed the stroller and offered to put Summer in the seat so that we could leave. That way she wasn't walking through the parking lot. She didn't want to sit, so we agreed to push the stroller together. While she was standing to my left, I bent down to put my purse back in the undercarriage, and when I stood back up, Summer was gone. I had first thought that maybe it was because she was getting tired and she moved to the seat anyways, but she wasn't in the seat, nor was she to my right. I did a quick 360 scanning the area close to me, and to my horror, I still didn't find her. And that's when I started to panic. I called for her, screaming her name, and I didn't get a response. A woman with her own kid was nearby and asked me what happened, and she tried to keep me calm and help look for her too. We checked in both restrooms, the area around it, and even all over the food area. I know that I was freaking out, and rightfully so. My kid just vanished within seconds, and no one claimed to have seen her. I know she was a kid, but I also knew her, and I knew that she wouldn't just walk off around people that she didn't know, and she wouldn't willingly go with someone that she didn't recognize. I called the police, and someone at one of the food vendors alerted their security people too. I didn't want to go much further outside the area that I last saw her, just in case she was still close so she could find me, but they suggested that I go to the front so I could speak to the police and take a report. Reluctantly, I agreed, and as I headed to the front, I saw 2 cops, and the ticket person at the entrance, and also Summer. I remember yelling her name and hearing her scream, "Mommy," as she ran to me, which was one of the most gut-wrenching feelings ever. I ran over to the cops with her in my arms, asking if they knew what happened. The ticket guy said that he saw a guy approaching the exit with her, and that she was crying and screaming and pushing him away. He was trying to do anything that he could to keep her quiet without looking suspicious, I guess, but the ticket guy said that it didn't seem right and stopped to ask if everything was alright. He tried to give some line about her being his kid or something to that effect, and Summer kept saying things like, "No, stranger, I don't know him," which alarmed this guy, and he then tried asking him for ID and threatened to call the cops. When he said that, the guy shoved Summer at him and took off. He didn't get to see what car, if any, he got into, as he didn't want to leave Summer alone. I couldn't have been any more grateful that this kid went way above his job to stop this guy. Anyone could have just looked at it and thought it was a kid throwing a tantrum, but he actually paid attention, and he realized that that was not what was happening. I was also incredibly proud of Summer for screaming and fighting this man and speaking up, too. I had taught her not to approach strangers, so she understood what that meant. But it's just not something you think you would ever have to remember. They never found the guy that night, and I was never contacted about it, so I don't think they ever did. But, my God, that was single-handedly the most terrifying day of my life, and I will never forget the fear that I felt. I know Summer remembers it too, as she is still a happy and playful child, but she didn't really fight sitting in the stroller or holding my hand at all times again. Just hold your kids tight, and be sure to teach them stranger danger. It can definitely save a life, or at least change it within seconds. This actually happened to me just a few years ago, when I had started a guy that I knew back in high school, named Chance. We added each other on Facebook and started talking, and had agreed to meet up. We were both very different people in school, and I think we definitely matured and changed, which made it work out. He was typically in the spotlight in class, but he wasn't really a jock or anything. He was on the wrestling team, but he didn't make it his personality. He just had a way with people. He was very charismatic, so everyone got along with him. Me, on the other hand, I was the quiet girl that always avoided attention. I had friends and I wasn't bullied or anything, but I just kind of kept to myself. Our paths didn't really cross much while in school, so it was a bit of a surprise when he added me and wanted to have dinner. I had no idea why he would have had an interest in me, but I decided to move forward with it. Color me surprised when we actually hit it off. He was quiet when we went out, and didn't act at all like the person from school. He said that he gave up wrestling after school because he wasn't really interested in it. His mom wanted him to play football, but he was actually afraid to play and get seriously injured, so they both agreed with wrestling. He was actually a graphic designer now, and was making decent money. I told him what I did after school, which was more schooling, as I wanted to be a veterinarian, but then realized it was a lot harder mentally than it seemed. Seeing injured and dying pets was very hard, so instead I became a vet tech. I pet, house sat, and I volunteered at shelters a lot. I got to see a lot more of the happier side of animals that way. He didn't make fun of me and said that that was very honorable as well. We actually started dating after that, and I realized he was completely different from who I thought he was in high school. We started hanging out a lot, him at my place more than anything because he also lived with his mom still, but we still had a great time. I learned that he was very affectionate, which was really sweet at first, but then he started becoming more and more clingy. It started as just asking me where I was going when I left the living room, but it got kind of annoying when he did it every time. Like, when I was making dinner, I would go sit down for a bit and then get back up to check on it, and he would still ask me. Of course, that was just something small, so it wasn't enough to make me end the relationship or anything. But then, it would just get worse. He would call me at 6:01 on the dot, when I got off work, to ask me what I was doing. If I was out too long at the grocery store or visiting my parents, he would call or text me consistently. I was under some stress as my mom had been battling cancer, so when he did this when I was with her, I got pretty upset. I talked with him about it too, telling him that it was too much. He freaked out and kept apologizing and pleading for me to not leave him. Again, I had no intentions of leaving him. I still thought that it was something that could be worked on and assured him of that, but we just needed to make some changes. To which he agreed. Things started getting better, though. He wasn't as clingy, but he still did have his moments. I even stayed at his place one weekend, and that was when I met his mom, Lynette. After meeting her, I could definitely tell that he was a mama's boy. He was very sweet to her, always willing to help her do anything strenuous, helping with setting the table or doing the dishes. Lynette always involved me with making dinner too, saying it was a woman's job and that she had to make sure her baby was well fed by making sure I could cook. The way she said it, I just thought it was a joke at first. I know that we were in a pretty steady relationship as we had been together for about 6 months or so, but I wasn't making any life plans just yet. She often talked to him like he was still a kid too, which that was weird to me. I also wasn't allowed to sleep in the same room as him, and she made me sleep in her room while she slept on the couch. I mean, come on, we were grown adults. Anyways, still, I got past it and moved on from there. Apparently, me not immediately running after meeting his mom was a sign of acceptance to him, so he started talking about long-term plans, as he put it. He started asking about getting married and how many kids I wanted to have. This caused me to finally slam the brakes. I told him that I was in no way ready to think about any of that, as we hadn't been together for that long, which did seem to upset him, but I was sure to put my foot down on the matter. Unfortunately, things got even worse. While he didn't make plans, he still continued talking about marriage, and to add to the stress, my mother passed away. I was grieving, and it was very difficult as I was so close to her. I thought for sure that I would be able to rely on Chance because I needed comfort. I needed someone to help me get through this. But that would never happen. He comforted me the first day, but then, after that, he always tried to one-up me. I'm a mess, going through my mom's stuff, and he just kept complaining about being bored or feeling tired or this and that. I told him that he didn't have to stay there if he didn't want to, and he started complaining more, wanting me to go somewhere with him. I let it go, but I started noticing that he was taking advantage of my vulnerability. He would try to convince me to do things that he wanted, and he would always phrase it like I was neglecting him because of my mom, or even saying things like, "Don't you think your mom would have wanted this?" All the way to the point that he was trying to convince me to have kids. Maybe part of it was the grieving, but I'd had enough. I told him that we needed some time apart so I can get through this, and then maybe we could try again. I thought maybe I was really being a bit much, but I also had just lost my mom. To my surprise, he understood, and he took it way better than I thought. Maybe it was the fact that we had agreed to get back together that he held on to, but either way, I appreciated that he didn't make it difficult. So I decided to try to move forward. I went to the funeral alone. I finished going through her stuff alone and was just alone. One night while I was home, I actually got a phone call from Chance's mother, Lynette. She wanted to give me her condolences and said that she wanted to make a wellness basket for me. I thought it was very kind of her and I agreed, but what I thought was a genuine care call turned into almost a stern talking to about when Chance and I were going to get back together and how selfish it was of me to break up with him. I told her to forget the basket and hung up. This didn't stop her from showing up at my work and even my dad's house looking for me. It was typically easy to get her to leave, but then her appearance was getting worse. Instead of just asking for me to talk, she started saying things to others about me. Like telling guys that she saw at my work to avoid me because I was a harlot and I wasn't a virgin. I was so mortified, but I went out there and personally told her to leave, in a not so nice way. She then started stalking me, watching me as I left work, when I went to the store, and even to my doctor's appointments. I'd finally had enough when she actually showed up to the Halloween party my work was having. She showed up, stopping people as they entered to warn them about me. I won't repeat what she called me, but she was claiming that I had numerous diseases. When I did confront her, I told her to leave me alone and reminded her that Chance and I were not together anymore. She would just ignore that and talk about how we were meant for each other and that I could just be baptized to become a virgin again. I told her that I was not interested in her son or her crazily obsessed family anymore, and I left. I reported it to the police, but of course they said they couldn't do anything about it because she hadn't actually done anything to me. Of course, I finally got them to do something when she started hanging up flyers on and around my neighborhood with my picture and some pretty awful things being said about me. I got a restraining order, and she was also told that if she made any flyers or anything of that sort about me again, it would also violate the order. To my surprise, that actually seemed to stop her. I don't know whose idea it was, either Chance or Lynette, but after the order, Chance tried calling and texting me too. Except he was a little easier to get to back off. I told him I didn't want anything to do with him or his mom ever again, and he just stopped calling. I later told some of my friends about what all had happened, because all they really knew was that we were dating. He was clingy, and we broke up. One of them thought that he had a few screws loose, as she remembered the way he acted when she was taking pictures in high school for one of the wrestling games. They were both very affectionate towards each other, like more than just a mom and son should be. Like, gee, I guess thanks for the warning, right? Anyways, it may not have been all that creepy for some, but being stalked by my ex would have been one thing. Being stalked by his mother was even worse. The humiliation that she caused was bad enough, but I was just thankful that I had worked at that company for so long. It at least didn't hurt my reputation with them. They even joked about it with me, thankfully. I've stayed single since this happened, and I'm not sure that I want to even think about dating anytime soon. But as for Chance and Lynette, I really hope that we never ever meet again. And this was a collection of stories that took place in the great month of October. Some of you may think to yourself, hey, Raven, isn't this just another set of fall stories, autumn stories, however you want to look at it? And to that I say, does October fall in the fall? Is October in the fall? Is October fall in the autumn? Does October, autumn, in the fall? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. So yes, they are. What are you going to do about it? Probably nothing. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the stories and the video, and if you did, please, my friend, hit that thumbs up button. And if you didn't enjoy the video and really want to stick it to me and tell me how bad I am at narration and how terrible these stories were and how I have absolutely no appropriate cadence or how I have no emotion in my voice or how I'm monotone the entire way through, hit that thumbs up button. That will show me. That's right, you heard me correctly. And if you really liked what you heard and you're new to the channel, please consider subscribing. That really does make me happy. It helps a lot. A lot, a lot. So yeah. And if you feel so bold, you could leave me a comment, letting me know your thoughts. What's on your mind, friend? What do you want to get out into the world? What do you want me to respond to? What do you want me to read? Just let me know. Yeah. Really quick note, I guess, here about the Ask Me Anything video coming up here very soon. Questions are still open. Link is in the description. I'm going to open that through the rest of the month. And possibly the first part of November, but it will be closing soon because I do need to harvest the questions and I do need to get them out there into an audio format to put them together. And yeah. So if you have a question that you want to ask me, it can be pretty much anything. I will answer most questions. Just go to the link down in the description for the AMA or Ask Me Anything 2022. Yeah. Looking forward to it, friends. Anyways, all that said, friends, I do hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. Hope you're having a great weekend. And I hope I see you on the next one. But until then, remember, you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you are the best you that you can possibly be. And nobody should ever tell you otherwise. Don't let them. Or if they do, don't listen to them. They're not relevant. Yeah. Anyways, friends, see you next time. And until then, of course, sleep well.